Right now, new reaction to Secretary of State Clinton's testimony about the Benghazi attack before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee this morning. The secretary taking questions on the terror attack that killed 4 Americans at the consulate, including our ambassador to Libya. We are joined now by one of the members of that committee, one of the people asking the questions, Senator Jon Barrasso of Wyoming. Senator, it's good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, John.
You asked about the security situation at the consulate and whether or not the secretary was satisfied with the arrangements that were made. Are you satisfied with the answer?
No, I'm not, because it sounds to me like they believe that security was adequate. At least that's what they told the American people. But they should have known in advance that the security was inadequate. There had been attacks in Benghazi against the British ambassador, against the Red Cross, and including our own consulate. So the story that they were telling the American people right after the attacks is very different than what we now know to be the case. So I think the secretary was well prepared. She gave the answers that she chose to give. But let's face it, that I asked additional questions about al-Qaeda, and the president just 2 weeks before the election had said that al-Qaeda had been decimated.
Right.
We know, in fact, that al-Qaeda has been on the rise, not on the run.
And she seemed to back away from her boss, President Obama's statements about whether or not al-Qaeda has been decimated.
Yeah, she kind of put the little qualifier in there where she said, well, core al-Qaeda, referencing Osama bin Laden and what had been happening in Afghanistan. I mean, those are the real concerns. And my concern is still no one has been brought to justice. Not the terrorists who did this, nor really adequately people within the State Department who have been moved from one post to another, but really haven't been forced to pay the price by losing their own jobs as a result of the mistakes that were made that resulted in this. So those are the concerns and questions that continue, and they're going to continue in the questioning of Secretary Kerry in his hearings tomorrow.
Yeah, it does seem strange that this pretty scathing review board report came out, and yet nobody really has been disciplined in much of a sense over all of this that's happened, including the death of our first ambassador in more than 30 years.
Well, that's exactly right. In spite of the president's promise that he would bring to justice those that did that, we haven't seen justice overseas with the terrorists. We haven't seen justice at home with those in the State Department. And overseas, you look at what has just happened now with al-Qaeda connected groups in northern Africa. I wonder, are they just emboldened because no terrorist was actually had to pay the price for the terrorist attacks and the murder of our 4 brave Americans in Benghazi?
Senator, if you'd be good enough to stay with us over a break, there's another exchange of you with the secretary that I'd like to play for our viewers and, again, amplify your thoughts on that. If you'd be good enough to stay with us, we'll be back right after.
Absolutely. Thanks, John.
We asked the question, and Senator Risch talked about, were the people that perpetrated the recent attacks in Algeria, were they part of this, or were they made perhaps emboldened because no one has yet paid a penalty for the attack on our facility in Benghazi? And how can we make sure that people are actually brought to justice there?
Continuing now with our interview of Senator Jon Barrasso of Wyoming, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and one of those who questioned Secretary of State Clinton this morning. In that question that we played just before we went to the commercial break, you spoke about this recent attack in Algeria that resulted in the deaths of dozens of hostages, Americans among them. Your question seemed to suggest that in your view, you feel that is related to our response or lack thereof in Libya. Is it?
Well, I believe it is. That's still being questioned, but we have no one currently in custody as a result of the attacks in Libya. There is no one being held accountable in terms of the terrorists. We know that in Benghazi, that was very close to an al-Qaeda-linked terrorist training center. It was a hotbed for al-Qaeda-related activities. Now we see this whole area of northern Africa where you have additional al-Qaeda-linked activities, and it just makes me concerned that these folks may feel emboldened emboldened because of the lack of the response by the administration to actually bring them to justice. And when I asked Secretary Clinton that question, she said, well, the president has promised and you can take the president at his word. Well, I don't necessarily take the president at his word. We need to make sure as Americans that these people are brought to justice, and we need to hold our elected officials and specifically this administration accountable.
So more than 4 months out from the Benghazi attack, you are not confident that anyone will be brought to justice?
No, I am not, and I don't feel any more reassured after talking to the Secretary of State this morning.
Wyoming Senator Jon Barrasso, a Republican. Thank you.
Thank you, John.